A Coherence Theory of Truth. Introduction. We conventionally take for granted that logic is essentially a systematic method of symbolic manipulation within some given parameterized set of language rules. Historically, however, in ancient Greece, the first attempts of articulating in what the meaning of logic might consist was investigated from the perspective of its function in dialogical interaction between parties to philosophical discourse, wherein reason demonstrates proof of claims presented, and the truth of things, whereby the proper order of things may be revealed. Logic since, however, has become a formal project with strict rules that dictate what does or does not count as a valid move in drawing reasonable conclusions. The results of Gödel are typically seen as limits to this logical project, but if we take a different approach toward what exactly logic means, we might come to see Gödel's results with new eyes that point to a view of understanding the meaning of truth in a way that has been waiting for elaboration. We may grasp something new and in turn uncover the essence of logic with fresh sight. I am claiming that the beginning of that elaboration is found herein. The problem of logic and meaning. Meaning and truth are inextricably interdependent. There can be no theory of either without reference to the other. The reason is that both are grounded in logic. So, to answer our question, what would a coherence theory of truth look like, necessarily begins with an outline of what is understood by the phrase such and such is logical. There are formal logics of various sorts, stretching as far back as Aristotle's syllogism. But by the end of this essay, I hope to demonstrate that what we understand by logic will be radically revised, where syllogistic reason is not simply seen as a special case of some more general theory of in what logical reason consists, but that instead to pursue understanding in terms of pure syllogistic reason is to necessarily deviate from absolute truth. This is important because even though far more powerful forms of logic have been developed since particularly in the 20th century, those models of logic all frame the process of derivation in the same terms as understood syllogistically. The singular purpose of such logical frameworks is to eliminate ambiguity, to provide a roadmap that would ascertain where we might best hope to find the certainty we seek, scientifically, philosophically, and historically. We draw upon more obscure models and ideas that have not yet been formally and rigorously formulated in any recognizably sensible fashion. My aim here is to formulate that theory of truth and meaning, so as to rigorously establish an understanding that surpasses what has come before regarding what we take logic to be, the essence of logic. I am claiming that formal, symbolic, logico-mathematical systems that construe derivation as an algorithmic process that dictates how to arrive at certain truth from given or known axiomatic definitions, and truths, together with a predefined set of steps, fails to grasp something essential, without which logic cannot account for natural understanding, and so necessarily exceeds those formally reductive systems. What was originally so fascinating about the syllogism for the rationally inquiring mind was not the idea of an algorithmic procedure that takes parameters, propositions, assumptions, premises, sentences, and produces a derivation of truth, but rather in how the syllogism demonstrates, exposes a noetic function, and reveals a mechanics of interpretation and meaning. What was previously implicit in noetic function becomes explicitly revealed as interpretation through the interpretive philosophical act. The syllogism, as delineating a procedure for arriving at truths, from one aspect, presents an algorithmic picture of truth. If one were to rigorously collect and define all our definitions together with all available ostensible data, one would then formally arrive at the very ultimate truth of reality, as there would be no ambiguity, precision would be absolute, and unknown variables aside, knowledge of the world one has access to would be fully exhausted through the derivation of all possible truths from the given sentences available. Sentences are the basic form of propositions, but convey the need for our proper understanding of logic to move out of the constraints of formally derivable systems, which impose strict conditions on the truth values available to propositions. If logic means anything at all, then it means anything only through its function in natural language, not formal procedural systems of derivation. Then what kind of noetic interpretation is being revealed that I am claiming to be significant? A convincing thesis which sheds a good deal of light upon Western metaphysical thought is in seeing how noetic essence's understanding participates in existence with being's continual refusal to adhere to the categories of noesis. Noetic content, upon reflection, exhibits essential structures in that content. The noetic function reveals its hidden essence in relation to its content. That thesis holds that a noeticization oscillates back and forth between being and essence. In view of that picture of noeticization, or rather the insights I have personally gained from that thesis, the logic of Aristotle is not an invention of something new, but a revelation of something old. If what I'm saying were false, we would need an account of how prior civilization achieved any kind of reasoning without explicitly deriving its results. And we know that mathematical thought is much older than Aristotle. I am not suggesting that prior acts of deduction followed the form of syllogism, but rather that it followed a different, less explicit mode of noetic movement. The syllogism distorts that prior mode of noetic rationality, that being of reason, by the explicit listing of its premises. But we don't have to travel back in time to see what was going on with noesis prior to Aristotle. Mind still conducts its operations the same today, while they remain hidden. When mind grasps a thing's essence, it is rarely in terms of a syllogistic derivation that strictly spells out premises or other formally symbolic logical operations. Instead, mind does not proceed with certainty, and where it attempts to do so is repeatedly met with failure in a way that demonstrates exactly why one ought not proceed so. To be emphatic, I want to reiterate that the goal here is not to overturn syllogistic reasoning, but to supplement it with a more rich concept of in what the essence of logic consists. If we are to hold that logic proper shuns prima facie contradictions, that logic cannot proceed where contradictions appear in the premises, then we are also holding that logic is unable to grapple with reality. The revolutions in thought we are familiar with philosophically, scientifically, culturally would make no sense. We would be confronted with one single eternal question: why did we not see this before? Contradictions form the fabric of noesis. We know this is accurate upon reflection, but it causes some disillusionment at the same time. Yet we oscillate in our recognition of the fact. We are forced to ask, how is contradiction fundamental to reality? Not short of empirical contradictions as examples, nor falling into speculative metaphysics, I want instead to concentrate for the time being on the noetic experience of logic instead. Yet the strongest argument that what is being said here has validity is that one ought to recognize too, that if natural language is not capable of reason proper, logic, such that pure logic is only possible in a procedural syllogistic mode of reason that eschews uncertainty or contradiction, then one needs to explain what Aristotle thought he was describing in the first place. I am assuming the reader would not hold to the idea that Aristotle invented the very being of logic and reason itself. That would be far more absurd than anything so far argued here. What I'm suggesting is, if what we understand as logic, or precisely its essence, if it is not that method, by which we reason with natural language in everyday life and communication but some symbolic abstraction, then we are talking about two very different things. For my part, what I have learned in strict mathematical logic, predicate calculus and so on, is merely a discipline that prepares one for the proper use, articulation, thinking and reasoning in natural everyday language. So then, the question of in what does the essence of logic consist rests upon a deeper revelation of the kind of derivation that takes place in noetic space with respect to language and thought as such. The upshot is that logic of everyday language grapples with contradiction at each moment, without hesitation. This needs no further evidence than mere reflection on one's own interactions and reflections each and every day, and further, that to deny that logic is central to the functioning understanding involved in such situations is to deny reality itself. From derivation to interpretation. Framed this way, we can see that things now hinge on the notion of derivation, but we have also learned something about the nature of logic and its essence already. Knowing already that logic is something that connects sentences to sentences, we understand logic now as a function that transforms sentences in a way that maintains meaning across transforms. We know this function already as that of interpretation. And so, very quickly, we arrive at our first conclusion that derivation is interpretation. This breaks significantly with formally reductive algorithmic systems of symbolic logic, not, however, as stated above, in a way that detracts from those systems by unhinging the rigidity of syllogistic certainty. How? By sidestepping the Aristotelian laws of logic, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. We dispense with those laws right now, but will radically reinterpret them in a new light after sufficiently grasping where we stand at this stage. We can take belief to be any proposition we hold to be true, regardless of its objective truth status. If such propositions are in fact true, then we can name these beliefs knowledge. But the problem is that historically, our truth claims are repeatedly defeated to a degree that now it's very difficult to entertain the idea that we might strictly achieve objective truth to the measurable degree which empirical criteria hold us to, empiricism being the standard epistemic framework we might validly speak from within. Recognition of this kind of truth, the truth or the fact that objective truth repeatedly exceeds our grasp, empirically, metaphysically, axiomatically, the question of what are the fundamental axioms for a complete mathematical foundation that would allow the construction of an absolutely consistent mathematical edifice, psychologically, historically, culturally, legally, and aesthetically, and so on, means we ought not yet entertain the idea of adequately arriving at a complete anticipated picture of in what strict knowledge would consist. It simply means we cannot start with knowledge, and obtaining the right kind of axiom would defeat this initial step. Although we need to start with some sense of belief, we cannot take this to be knowledge in the precise sense of meaning that the object of belief is objectively true. There can be no axiomatic starting point which cannot later come under question itself. We are not eschewing knowledge or truth for a skepticism that would deny both, but beginning a journey with a clear understanding of what we will not accept, because at this stage, nothing meets our standards of knowledge or truth. Yet, the abstraction of logic into symbolic formalism has had the effect of making it appear that meaningful language is not altogether sufficiently logical but deviant in some way. Holding one view of the peripatetic laws of logic have been effective in arriving at that conclusion. But while the scholastics were operational in ensuring that position would hold, that the laws of logic must be strictly adhered to, they, the scholastics, also recognized the analogical ground of meaning stemming from both the peripatetics and Platonists. Analogy holding a peculiar duplicity of meaning that stirred nearly 1,000 years of Latin inquiry on analogy. But rather than explore logic from the scholastic perspective, I want rather to return to Aristotle's original text as evidence of where things may have taken another turn. However, do not take this argument as the suggestion that the formal rigor of mathematical logic is somehow flawed. If we arrive at a new construal of logic at all, it will be one that embraces formal rigor but expands its horizon to include greater meaning, not less. In that case, if we succeed, then what has passed would be seen as a necessary path, not a flawed one. Aristotelian hermeneutics. I have suggested that the essence of logic is derivation, and that derivation in turn is a transformation between sentences, a method for transforming one sentence into another. My grounds for arguing this are, as stated above, grounded in the hermeneutic recognition that Aristotle's elucidation of the syllogism was an attempt at rendering into abstract essence what is already taking place in noesis, and that act of noesis concerns the manipulation of meaning. But if this were the case, that the essence of logic concerns the act of interpretation, then the essence of logic must concern communication. And that is exactly what we find in Metaphysics Book 4, where immediately after describing the law of non-contradiction, Aristotle is concerned with logic as the art of demonstration, instructing, and communication. However, something very modern happens at this point. Aristotle recognizes something acutely hermeneutical, that it is the listener who is responsible for conveying the meaning of logical demonstration upon the arguments made by some speaker. The text by Aristotle of this point cannot be underestimated. We can, however, demonstrate negatively even that this view is impossible, if our opponent will only say something, and if he says nothing, it is absurd to seek to give an account of our views to one who cannot give an account of anything, insofar as he cannot do so. For such a man, as such, is from the start no better than a vegetable. Now, negative demonstration I distinguish from demonstration proper, because in a demonstration one might be thought to be begging the question, but if another person is responsible for the assumption, we shall have negative proof, not demonstration. The starting point for all such arguments is not the demand that our opponent shall say that something either is or is not, for this one might perhaps take to be a begging of the question, but that he shall say something which is significant both for himself and for another, for this is necessary, if he really is to say anything. For if he means nothing, such a man will not be capable of reasoning, either with himself or with another. But if anyone grants this, demonstration will be possible, for we shall already have something definite. The person responsible for the proof, however, is not he who demonstrates but he who listens, for while disowning reason he listens to reason. And again, he who admits this has admitted that something is true apart from demonstration, so that not everything will be so and not so. If what I'm arguing is correct, then it ought to appear, upon contemplation of the matter, quite straightforward, and that the issue is neither here nor there. But the problem is, on the contrary, very much the opposite. Where we have arrived with contemporary logical models is a strict adherence to a picture of the meaning of logic as algorithmically computational and symbolically proof verifying modes of arriving at certainty. And this is not what is understood when considering the meaningful exchange between two partners in dialogue. In which case, what I am arguing here is that the original misunderstanding of logical and procedural derivation divorced from what noesis does caused us to in turn, and symmetrically, divorce dialogue from interpretation as such, whereby meaning must necessarily come to an end in such experience, meaning now only available through the rigor of grappling with a symbolic framework that seeks neither to describe meaningful interpretive interaction nor the meaning of its own internal structure, but instead to computationally calculate and produce proofs, with certainty, even if necessarily statistically weighted and so requiring interpretation in turn. And if this all holds, what we achieve is making symbolic computation a special case of logical reason, where logical reason is the act of giving meaning to sentences by altering sentences without altering the meaning of those sentences. But for argument's sake, let's simply assume this does hold, that Aristotle understood by logic the natural demonstration of meaning between parties in dialogical interaction, less a system of procedurally or computationally arriving at certainty, but instead more a method of achieving clarity in natural language, to see where this leads. But first let's take stock of what we have arrived at so far. Firstly, we take derivation to be interpretation, a transformation between sentences while maintaining meaning, and we mean this in a Koinen sense. If we take conceptual schemes as a precondition for observability, then any statement is necessarily already entangled in an analytic web of self-reinforcing concepts, meaning derivation necessarily is interpretation. Remaining within such a schematic framework becomes important when in the justification of syntactic transformations. Secondly, we came to understand Aristotle as supporting this notion of logic being an interpretive act in his placing of responsibility upon the listener, not the speaker. This is important because it strictly adheres to a notion of charitable interpretation that is native to a formally hermeneutical view of reason, meaning, and language. Thirdly, we pointed to a notion of an axiomatic system being something intrinsically self-contradictory in holding that one does not begin with truths. For what then would be the point of the project in the first place? Lastly, concerning truth itself, we only alluded to the notion of truth in regards to certainty, but we did not spell it out beyond that, and the reason for that is contained in the previous point that we do not yet know what is truth. One does not begin with truth, and so we are unable to spell out exactly what a proper understanding of that is, just yet. So then, what we now need is to paint a picture of what truth might look like outside that system of formally rigorous certainty, and ask the question, how does truth even have any meaning at all outside such a notion of certainty? The logic of noetic space. Where syllogistic reason construes derivation to be proof, such that proof means arriving at certainty, we instead see derivation as interpretation, while conducting the very same act of sentence transformation enacted computationally. And where we differ is in our dropping the notion of axiomatic truth. The problem with axiomatic systems is the descent into a deviant infinite regress, or bad infinity. When any axiom comes under question, the analyst is forced to step back and seek further meta-support statements, or evidence, for something that was never previously under question, a painful process. We will find that a symmetrically parallel action occurs with coherence, but where that infinite justificatory path circles or spirals, ascending towards greater meaning rather than descending into absurdity, a kind of true infinite in contrast to a negative bad type of infinite regress. But what is evidence? In procedural logic, evidence is a way of joining sentences to produce the derivation. For procedural logic, one might say that the evidence is independent of the sentential form of any predicate. It is the semantic meaning that supplies evidence, not the grammar nor the syntax. But this differs in our hermeneutical understanding of supporting evidence. The premises of any derivation step supply evidence in the entire derivation. For interpretation, the evidence is simply the sentences stated in their given form. We take that evidence to be the grammatical syntax of those predicates. Is this distinction important, and why? We cannot address this question yet, but it is relevant. Suffice it to say that it is important and concerns that peculiar idea of Aristotle's that it is the responsibility of the listener to give meaning to the proof and not the other way around. But we have a problem here, already. We have restricted logical access to that which takes place within noesis. However, this essay is a short piece on the essence of logic in analytical hermeneutics. It is not an exhaustive ontological analysis of existence, and while there is scope to explore the question of logic and existence, we have to draw the line somewhere and return to what cannot be addressed here at another point. For now, we are dealing with analytical belief, conceptual schemes, and worldviews. Here then, in the space of worldviews and belief, we are no longer dealing with sentences, or language as traditionally understood, but nous. And in this noetic space, syntax behaves differently from discrete manipulatable units, or atoms, of semantic meaning. Belief in this noetic space is not alphabetical, but far more mathematically or geometrically ordered. I am not painting a picture of a quantum processing mind in the Penrose sense, but rather something similar in the steady-state model of mind. Unlike a traditional computational processor deterministically clocking over bitwise instructions that manipulate bits of discrete data, something not strangely absent in empirical studies of mind. Instead, mental phenomena are held to be more wave-like, following the path of phase space into stable minimal entropy states of attraction, or what we might call conceptualization. I am not describing this to sound pretty or cute. It is a mathematically precise empirical model of brain behavior. The technical problem of identifying mind's procedural function is that symbolic logic is not calculated by mind without explicit articulation, either by pen or speech. Mind, nous, is not a symbolic processor, but a manifold of maximal and minimal states of activity in a highly orthogonal state space. Accepting this is to construe logical derivation in terms that differ from the long-standing view of logic as a stepwise algorithmic procedure for deduction, justification, and the geometry of truth. Now it is possible to see the function of deduction as interpretation operating in nous with clarity in a way previously unavailable. If meaning is a stable state of that noetic phase space or state space, then logic would be transforms of that space that retain the integrity of its coherence. Deduction as interpretation makes complete sense from this perspective. But this is just one way to understand the fundamental essence of noetic reason. Articulating the process of reason in this space by communication to another flattens this state space into alphabetic sequence or semantic structure. And this is the only verifiable way of determining what logic might look like. Currently, we have no way of mapping neural state space with logical forms, so that we might think of articulating one's reasons as a collapse of that state space into said semantic sequences of meaningful communication. And we are interested in this aspect of logic because it is the only one that we can account for today. Interpretation now functions as justification, in the same way that deduction serves as justification in the classical sense of procedural syllogistic logic. Now, meaning is the measure of truth. If truth is valid derivation from valid premises, the truth now becomes the meaningful interpretation of valid premises. We naturally understand that this makes sense because if it didn't, then logic would not make sense. But the test of this perspective is not neural science and mathematical models of semantic state-space collapse, but simply in the way that this perspective makes sense of conventional logical form. If this perspective holds, then it ought to also explain all other logical forms so that those logical forms, theories, become special cases of this view. But that is what we have arrived at already. If those theories of logic did not make sense, meaningfully, we would not consider them as valid in the first place, regardless of how abstract and seemingly dry of meaning here meaning would be the structural relationships that form the schema of those logical frameworks, void of any particularity. For example, the logical disjunctive operator does not function with predicates the way Nous apprehends the meaning of disjunction understood in the mundane everyday sense. But the structure of disjunction in any logical schema makes sense on its own terms, by the definitions of the system's rules, etc. The logical system abstracted from meaningful statements retains meaning the way any geometry does, in the way it derives results, and not in its alphabet nor its dry semantic structure. Assuming this picture of logic to be true, then justification embeds meaningful sentences and propositions in a large state space of possible attractors. Beliefs. The essence of logic is not a stepwise simplified listing of premises, definitions, axioms that support via symbolic rules the derivation of one additional and now provable truth. It is instead interpretation with infinite open-endedness. And the measure of a true or valid derivation becomes the degree to which we understand as meaningful the derived resulting statement. The consequence of this view is that contradiction holds as before, as Aristotle originally understood it, but where contradiction no longer points to untruth but instead insufficient or nonsensical interpretation, an interpretation that lacks meaning with respect to the wider phase space or conceptual scheme, it does not cohere. The special cases of symbolic and procedural logics still hold unaltered, but we now see logic's operation in nous, a noetic experience of logic that makes sense of the space inside reason without recourse to an alphabet. Now, understood as the project of collectively establishing truth, science now becomes a project of meaningful coherence. One might ask, but unique meaningful systems can cohere in themselves while deviating from each other. So we are forced to acknowledge that we would inevitably arrive at the conclusion, more than one coherent worldview exists. Let's call two such distinct worldviews A and B. Then how do we verify which of A and B is actually true? But this type of objection holds to the classical idea that logical contradiction is a logical impasse. Given our now non-deterministic understanding of nous, we recognize immediately that such an impasse is merely the result of our lack in ability to interpret between A and B such that the question of which is true between A and B is necessarily A plus B, where we derive or interpret a resulting statement that finds coherence between both A and B. Sixth conclusion: Gödel, truth, and metalanguage. What Gödel's result typically expresses is a flaw in the nature of logical structure. That is, until it is recognized that whenever a system's limits are breached in some Gödelian sense, we witness the same structural episode repeatedly, termed variously, incommensurate paradigm shift, encountering the limits of language, exposing fundamental flaws in a system's self-understanding, and so on. But the name is not important. What is important is that each time, historically, that this event occurs, what comes after is not hidden but well documented as a paradigmatic shift in understanding. Mathematically, such a shift results in the elaboration of a new field, in empirical sciences it manifests as scientific revolution. Culturally, it is seen as dialectical sublation of conflicting ideas or ideologies, and so on. It is repeatedly the same thing. First, shock and horror at the existence of some fundamental flaw or contradiction in the system of logic that reinforces the grounds of knowledge and discourse that function to make the system possible in the first place, followed by competing interpretations of the meaning of the challenge presented, and finally resulting in a new way of seeing things which, from a new perspective, appears to leave the original system intact as it ever was, but supplemented with fresh understanding that introduces new horizons of possibility for understanding, a new language or meta-language. It is a recursive process that makes sense of the old language by wrapping it anew in a new way of being. The old logical structures, and that includes everything expressible from within that old language, now make sense with new possibilities that were unavailable previously. New ways of apprehending reality, of seeing, of hearing, of being. It is this way of reckoning with a system's limits, its incompleteness, which I wish to present here in a coherent elaboration that makes such awareness possible. It needs to be said that I am not describing how things ought to be. This is a description of how we take history to proceed already. This is how things are, not how I wish them to be. Furthermore, in reckoning with such incompleteness, it is in confrontation that the once cherished, often forgotten axioms that established the system in the first place, which need to be revised in the light of some new metalanguage. It is that realization of a fallen ground of being, a seeming dismantling of the order of things, that encounters such force in opposition, and which resists change even in the midst of clearly apprehended contradictions that stem from those axioms. But if what is being presented here has any weight, and I argue that history supports these claims, then we are left asking the question, do any valid axioms exist? I have to bring this essay to a close now. However, the short answer is clear. In such a presuppositionless system of science or knowing, coherence is the only possible measure of truth, and one that adheres with our understanding. In such a science, we set out in the first place not with truth, but with the intention and conviction that we will arrive there. The emergence of metalanguage is non-deterministic and non-computable due to its inherent iterative recursion. But this fact supports the notion that noesis too seeks minimal entropy conditions in complex state spaces. And this brings us full circle in our reflection upon the coherent nature of dialogical understanding through interpretation, and the essence of logic as it pertains to noetic experience. However, what we can say regarding the emergence of those new modes of understanding is that new modes of thought rest on seeing metaphorical connections and analogical reason, both poetically and metaphysically,